All right. Good afternoon. My name is Christian Knudsen. I'm the host of EMS Medicine Live. I want to welcome you to our January 31st, 2017 session. As always, review, this is a opportunity to share information, lessons learned, basic knowledge, both for community EMS physicians and for EMS fellows in particular. We're obviously using Zoom for our talk today. If you have any questions, go ahead and chat me during the presentation. If it's really pressing, we'll break in and ask Dave a question. If it's not, we'll try to keep it for the end and have you ask the question at the end of the presentation. This talk is being recorded. You don't need to record it on your end. We will publish this on YouTube, Facebook, and our web page. If you Google EMS Medicine Live, the first three options will pop up and they're all should be there. Today's speaker is David Cohn. He's a professor and EMS section chief at Yale in the Department of Emergency Medicine. If you don't know Dave, he is an accomplished researcher with, I couldn't count how many publications he's had in the past decade or so. He is an author of pre-hospital care research and editor of NAEMSP's textbook, Clinical Practice and System Oversight. And today we're discussing emergency medical dispatch. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. As Christian said, I'm Dave Cohn. I'm at Yale. I should have put my email address on this slide in case anybody wants to get in touch with me later, so I'll just tell it to you. It's very easy, david.cohn@yale.edu. I'll give it to you again at the end. And the topic today is physician oversight of EMS dispatch. I do have a couple of disclosures. I am a certified dispatcher. I've been certified by the National Academy since 2004. Here's my card to prove it in case anyone doubts me. But I have no financial interest in any of the dispatch systems I'm going to talk about today or in the National Academies. We did get a small research grant from NAED back in 2005, and I'm going to talk about the study that project funded. The three main systems I'm going to talk about today, MPDS, PowerPhone, and APCO, are all in use in my region. So I have some familiarity with them all, but again, no financial ties to any of them. So here's our objectives. And as Christian said when he sent out the email about this yesterday, I am going to try to cover all of the core content topic areas in dispatch. I'll show you those in just a second here, but here's the general objectives. I want you to be able to describe the role of the physician, the EMS physician, in providing medical oversight in dispatch. I want you to be able to discuss the key clinical and operational aspects of dispatch that we, the physician, should have a role in, and a brief ability to outline the quality improvement process in dispatch that's recommended by the National Academies. So here is just literally cut and pasted from Deb Perina's 2012 core content. These are the core content topics for dispatch. We'll be talking about public safety answering points, the main issues of dispatch, and decisions that are made by the dispatchers regarding mode of response, hot versus cold, prioritization and tiers of response, and pre-arrival instructions. I should have no trouble hitting all these. We should have some time at the end for any questions that anybody wants to ask. So the first question is, why are we talking about this? I think most medical directors don't really see themselves as having much of a role in dispatch. But when you think about it, the dispatchers are making a number of clinical decisions and performing clinical functions every time they pick up the phone. Obviously, with the exception of walk-ins or an ambulance coming across a patient in the field, almost everybody who accesses the EMS system does so via 911 through the dispatch system. So obviously, these patients, this is where they all start. Our patients all start in this system here. And the dispatchers have to make a number of determinations. They need to perform a fairly sophisticated clinical interrogation to determine, number one, whether to send ALS or BLS resources to the scene, and number two, to send those lights and sirens or hot or no lights and sirens or cold. Once they've made those decisions and have sent the resources, they then need to provide instructions to the callers. That may be something very simple like turn on the porch light and put the dog away. It may be how to deliver a baby, how to perform CPR, how to manage a trach. And all of these, with the exception of the turning on the light and putting away the dog, are fairly sophisticated clinical interventions that we're asking our dispatchers to do. And I think just as we now expect that medical directors have a role in managing BLS as well as ALS, I think we need to extend that into the dispatch setting and begin our oversight of the EMS system at the public safety answering point where most of these encounters begin. So here is NAEMSP's position paper on the topic. You can easily pull it up off the NAEMSP website. There's how to do it in the top left corner there. The key piece is what I circled in blue there. EMD medical directors should participate in the design, operation, and data analysis of medical dispatch, and that's what we're going to talk about. So if you haven't had a chance to do so, pull this position paper down and take a look at it. I actually read through it yesterday because right now the Standards and Practice Committee is considering doing an update or revision just because it's coming up on the 10-year cycle now, but it's actually pretty good. There's not a whole lot of content in here that I think needs revision. So I think it's definitely worth taking a quick look to get a bit of an idea of what NAEMSP feels the physician's role in dispatch is. So I'm going to break this talk into 3 chunks here. The first chunk is just sort of a general overview of how EMD works. And the next thing that you're going to need to know when you finish up today and kind of go look at your dispatch system is how does it work where you are? It's going to be different pretty much everywhere you go. And then if you understand how it works best, you can kind of apply those principles to how it works where you work and try to improve your system. So this is going to be kind of the framework for the 3 sections of the talk. So my first piece of advice here, I think it is definitely worth taking the EMD course and becoming EMD certified. I put all my fellows through the full 3-day National Academies course. It's a really good 3-day course that would be really good if it were taught in 2 days. It's about 16 hours worth of material that they kind of spread out over 3 days. That's okay, you know, that happens fairly often with these kinds of courses. But I do believe that my fellows get a very good appreciation for what the dispatch environment is like. And I think the second bullet point there is probably the important piece. I don't think it's reasonable for us to provide medical oversight and quality management to a system that we don't really understand. And dispatch is so different from field EMS, as I learned when I started doing this, that simply having a good knowledge of EMS, a fellowship training, even if you had an extensive field provider background, it's not the same. It's a very different environment that you work in. So even when my fellows come through who've been paramedics or flight nurses or whatever before coming to me, I put them through the course and get them certified. And I think it really adds a good level of understanding for them of what the dispatch environment is all about. So let's talk briefly about how EMD works. I'm going to focus on the MPDS, the Medical Priority Dispatch System, the picture that's shown here on the screen, because that's the predominant system in my part of the country, and in fact through most of the country. Again, I have no vested interest. I'm not trying to promote them here. I'm just using them as an example. So I'm just going to very quickly, just by the low-tech approach of holding up my cards to the camera here, give you a quick overview of how this works. So what I have here is a set of the protocol cards. It's just a smaller version of the flip cards that you see in the photograph in the lower left corner of the screen. I will now tell you that very few people are using the flip cards. Most centers are now doing this on a computer, shown in the top right there. It's exactly the same questions. The computer enables you to skip through a bunch of things. And the really cool part about the computer system, as soon as you have answered enough questions for the computer to know what type of dispatch it is, it dispatches the case for you and allows the call taker to simply keep going, asking questions, providing pre-arrival instructions. So when you open the card set, the first thing that you'll see is the top screen here is simply a set of entry questions. And these are the what number are you calling from and what is your address type question. In case you get cut off from the dispatcher, they can at least get help to you. And then there's the, okay, tell me exactly what happened question. It's exactly the same as when you walk into an ED patient or when you approach somebody on the scene of a field run and ask that open-ended question, hey, what's going on? You get the basic story from the caller, which then gives you enough information to decide, is there an immediate life threat that I need to address right now? Or can I turn to one of the 32 chief complaint-based protocols that's going to guide me through the rest of the process? So let's just assume for the sake of argument that this particular caller gives a fairly straightforward scenario of my wife is having abdominal pain. You get through the questions about, is she breathing? Is she completely awake? Everything appears okay. You then flip to card number 1, which is the abdominal pain protocol, and it has a secondary set of questions that you go through to try to determine the severity of this particular case. And you can see there's color coding here. There's several levels of calls that this can be dispatched into. Once you've asked enough questions, the computer will tell you which of those it has selected and dispatches the call accordingly, ALS versus BLS, hot versus cold. Relatively straightforward system for determining what to send. And then in the top right corner of the screen is the pre-arrival instructions or the dispatch life support instructions that you're going to give to the caller until help arrives. And that allows you to provide some sort of intervention that the caller themselves or the bystander or family member can provide until resources arrive. So as I said, this is MPDS that I just reviewed. We're currently on version 13. I was just at a meeting this morning. Our regional dispatch committee met this morning. Almost everybody in my area has upgraded from version 12.2 up to version 13. As best as I can determine, it's the most commonly used system in the United States. And the 4 Commonwealth countries that you see there, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, exclusively use MPDS, which is very helpful in terms of data sharing and research opportunities. As best as I can determine, the next largest package out there is PowerPhone, which happens to be based here in Connecticut. So they actually have a fair number of cities and towns here in Connecticut that use PowerPhone. And this is just sort of a photocopy of the book. And you can see across the top of the screen are tabs for a number of the chief complaints. It's a very similar system. You ask some basic introductory questions, and then you flip to the tab with the chief complaint that seems to best match the problem. You then go through the key questions, you make your dispatch decisions on what resources you need to send, and then there's additional information down the bottom of the screen. The only other system that's in wide use in my area is a system called APCO, which is the abbreviation or the acronym for the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials. This is simply a trade organization for dispatchers and communication centers. And if you are a member of this organization, you have access to their dispatch system, which is shown here. Again, very similar. You can see the flip cards in the photograph in the top center. And then again, interrogation questions that you ask, and determining over on the right whether to send ALS or BLS, a very similar system. So the next thing you need to figure out once you sort of have a basic idea of how EMD works is, how does EMD work where you work? So I'm just going to simply walk through very briefly the regulations here in Connecticut. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not going to read every word on the screen here. But you need to do this where you are to get a basic sense of the state regulatory environment that your dispatchers are practicing in. So first I will tell you that prior to the enactment of this statute back in 1999 or 2000, there were no rules in the state of Connecticut for dispatch. Any dispatch center could do pretty much whatever they wanted. And in late 1999, early 2000, this statute was enacted that said that by July 1st of 2001, the office, and that's the state office of EMS, would essentially develop rules and regulations governing emergency medical dispatch in the state. So this would be training courses, some sort of certification method, continuing education for dispatchers, and they specifically indicated that this was going to need to meet the existing National Highway Traffic Safety Administration EMD National Standard Curriculum. The older timers in the room here will remember the National Standard Curricula that we had through NHTSA for the various levels of EMS personnel back until 2004, when we moved on to the current education standards. And what a lot of folks don't realize is there was an EMD National Standard Curriculum, just like there was for EMTs, EMTIs, paramedics, etc. So the state said that by 2001, the state is going to have some structure in place to formalize this. And then the next piece says that you have 3 years till July 1st of 2004 to bring your center into compliance with using some sort of approved dispatch system. So that, yes, it was an unfunded mandate. There was lots of yelling and screaming about that, but they gave you 3 years to do it. Plenty of time to budget for what you might need to do to train your dispatchers, get them certified, and bring your system online. And these are the components that were required in the statute. Again, we're not going to go through word for word here, but Part A is simply an organized system. This could be MPDS, it could be PowerPhone, it could be anything that you would like that has been approved by the state to provide your emergency medical dispatch. You must be using that system every time somebody picks up the 911 call. You must be providing continuing ed to your dispatchers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And importantly, item D, you need to have some mechanism in place to detect and correct discrepancies when a problem arises, when the protocol is not followed. That's essentially a quality management system that you have to have in place at your public safety answering point to make sure that your system is working optimally. The next piece describes that in a little bit more detail. You need to be looking at your dispatch time intervals. You need to be studying how long it takes from when the 911 phone rings until you actually dispatch the call. Can't be taking 5 minutes to dispatch a cardiac arrest. I just got some data from the local AMR dispatch center in our area, and on average, they dispatch a cardiac arrest call in 43 seconds. From the time the phone rings until the computer has enough information to actually dispatch the call out to a unit. I think 43 seconds is pretty darn good. Your quality assurance also needs to be managing the appropriateness of your dispatch protocols. This is things like updating the protocols from time to time, making sure they're being followed. And fortunately, we're very lucky here in Connecticut. If you look at the last sentence of E there, it requires physician involvement. There must be a physician involved in this quality assurance component of the program. And that's what we were doing at the meeting we had this morning. We have a large number of very small dispatch centers here in Connecticut. It's not feasible just on a logistical basis for me and my colleagues here in Yale Emergency Medicine to be going around to all these dispatch centers. So we just have regional meetings. We bring in all the PSAP directors and deal with issues on a group basis. Unfortunately, if you go back to this slide later on, I won't get into this much detail now, the wording of that sentence is kind of ambiguous. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what that physician role is. And we asked OEMS what they meant, and nobody who's there now was there back then, and they don't actually know what their intent was. But at least I've got some hook there that there needs to be physician involvement, and many states don't have that. I gave a similar talk to this up with Stacy Weisberg at her fellowship program at UMass in Worcester a couple years ago. So I pulled down the Massachusetts regulations just to compare them. And here they are. You can go back and read through them if you want to. But the basic principles are the same. There is a requirement in the Massachusetts State EMS Regulations that formal EMD is being done. And they've got a certification requirement, the same as we have here. They have standards for how this is going to be done. And it's actually very similar. They also have requirements for how the calls are handled. I put the PDF there if anybody wants to pull it up. So take a look at your own state regulations and see what they say. I think you may be a little bit surprised at what you see. Not too many states that I know of have that requirement for physician involvement in the oversight process. And that may be something that you may want to think about in your state. So everyone's heard the phrase in EMS, if you've seen one EMS system, you've seen one EMS system. I see John Kramer laughing. He might have been the first to say that. I don't know for sure. But this really applies to dispatch as well. So like I said, here in Connecticut, most of our cities and towns have their own PSAP. There's no regionalization here in Connecticut. Connecticut is one of only 2 states in the union with no counties. Connecticut and Rhode Island have no county structure. And the way that we, with our Yankee independence here in New England work, every town is responsible for providing its own police, fire, EMS, and dispatch. Some of the towns in the rural parts of the state are just so small that they can't do it. There's just not enough infrastructure there to do it. So we do have a little bit of regionalization in some of those rural areas. Where I am here in the greater New Haven area, the 12 towns that we provide medical oversight for the regular EMS system, not so much for dispatch. Each of those 12 towns has its own dispatch center. Many of them are so small, there's only one dispatcher on duty, which leads to a whole bunch of problems. A more typical model for much of the United States, obviously large cities will have their own, and many suburban areas will have one public safety answering point covering a county. This was the way it was set up in the Philadelphia suburbs where I initially trained, where police, fire, and EMS are all handled in a single dispatch center for a county. And that seems to provide a little bit more regionalization and some economies of scale. We've been trying to convince our dispatch centers here in Connecticut to regionalize. They laugh at us. The state is actually offering, literally bribing the dispatch centers. They will give you $250,000 for the infrastructure if any 3 or more towns are willing to merge their dispatch centers. And to the best of my knowledge, that's only happened once so far. As some of you may know, I did a sabbatical in Sydney, Australia back in 2011, and I visited the dispatch center. There are 4 dispatch centers for the whole state of New South Wales, and the one in Sydney covers a little bit more than half of all the calls for the state of New South Wales. It's 12 to 1,600 emergency calls per day. The one ambulance service in New South Wales also handles all the non-emergency traffic, so they're covered as well. And I asked them, how many guys do you have on duty? And at peak hours, they have 32 on duty. That drops down to 11 or 12 overnight. The total staff for the dispatch center, handling about 1 million calls a year, is 126, from the boss who runs the place all the way down to the bottom folks. To contrast that, here in my area, for 12 towns with a catchment population of around 400,000, I have 275 certified dispatchers. So clearly, we're not doing it right in terms of efficiency and economies of scale. Let's talk about how EMD is supposed to work in terms of quality management. And I think this is really where the physician needs to be involved. I do a fair amount of the continuing ed teaching here in our system. I don't do the initial training or certification. My main role as the dispatch medical director here in my area is to assist the services with their quality management. The note on the bottom there, this is not likely to be something that your boss has covered you for unless you actually have EMS coverage in your malpractice coverage, your liability coverage, or if you've purchased one of the 2 or 3 liability packages specific to EMS out there. So if you're going to get involved in providing oversight for dispatch centers, make sure you've got liability coverage for it. So this is a list of the areas that Jeff Clausen, who's widely considered to be the father of emergency medical dispatch, this is an article he published back in 1989, listing the components of a quality management program in emergency medical dispatch. And the three pieces that I've highlighted in bold there are the pieces that I believe the physician needs to have a role in. As I said, I'm not in the process of hiring or orienting, doing the initial training, getting the guys certified. That's on the PSAP. That's their own, internal town issues or whatever. My role is making sure that they're getting high quality continuing education, providing general medical oversight, and helping with performance evaluation, which typically is in the form of case review. So we're going to go through a couple examples of these and sort of describe how this process works. First, to just cover CDE very quickly, continuing dispatch education. Most states that have a requirement for this and the national academies require 1 hour per month. When you go to recertify your dispatcher card at the end of your 2-year cycle, you need to provide evidence of 24 hours of continuing ed in the prior 24 months. Very easy to get this continuing ed. There's magazine articles you can read. There's tons of online opportunities. We do a fair number of live in-person sessions here. You can also get some credit for things like participating in disaster drills. If you're participating in managing the communications aspect of a disaster drill, you can count that hour for hour toward the requirement. So it's relatively easy to get. Whenever I go to these sessions, I generally have a topic to talk about. So maybe we'll be talking about one of the particular dispatch protocols that seems to be tripping people up. But at the end, there's always sort of an open forum, and a lot of it turns into the exact same thing that happens when a paramedic curbsides you in the ED and says, "Hey doc, I had this case a couple of weeks ago. Can you tell me what you think?" And I think that's really kind of where the emphasis needs to be for us. So case review is probably just on a day-to-day basis what I do most as a dispatch medical director. One of the local PSAPs will contact me by email. They'll send the WAV file or whatever the audio file is of the case to me, tell me what their concern is, and ask me to listen to the call. Usually it's, do you think the protocol was followed? Did the dispatcher follow the protocol correctly? So I'll take out my trusty QA guide, I'll listen to the call, and I'll just walk through the questions. I'll listen to the conversation and try to get a sense of whether the process was followed or not. When the quality management staff at the PSAP are doing this, they have case review software that they can use to go through a call and score it essentially on how efficiently and how well it was handled. Were all the questions asked in the right answer? When a question should lead the dispatcher to do something else, was that instruction followed, etc. I'm just simply listening to the call, working through the protocol to see if I think it was followed. One caveat here is I can listen to the call as many times as I want to. I can listen to it over and over again. I can listen carefully from what might be going on in the background. I'm not also typing things in my computer and dispatching units at the same time. So you have to give the dispatchers a little bit of leeway that they're multitasking and they only get to hear this call once. And maybe they'll miss something in the background or misinterpret something, and that may drive how the rest of the call goes. And you just sort of have to be aware of that. It's actually easier to do a case review of an EMD case than most field cases because I've got the call. I can listen word for word to exactly what happened. When you're reviewing a field case, you're looking at the documentation, you're talking to the crews, you're getting sort of a he said, she said. You don't actually know what really happened. In this circumstance, I know exactly what happened because I'm hearing it exactly the same as the dispatcher did. So I actually think it's a little bit easier to QA an EMD call than a general QA of a field call. We know from some research that doing this and providing feedback to the dispatchers actually is helpful. The initial study Jeff Clausen did on this, which he published in Annals back in '98, when he implemented a quality management system, he did a very simple before and after study, looking at the 2 months before they put in a regular structured feedback system and 2 months after, and their compliance with the protocols jumped from 76% to 96%. And most of this feedback is general feedback to the entire dispatch center staff, not one-on-one. So it may be saying, hey, we did our review and we found that everybody's screwing up the seizure card. Our compliance on the seizure card as a group is not very good. Let's go over, let's have a CDE session on it and try to figure out what we can do better. So it's sort of that kind of feedback as opposed to pulling a dispatcher in and telling them, hey, you really screwed up this call, and if you don't do better next time, I'm going to fire you. It's the general approach that we like to take with EMS quality management. So I'm going to try to play this case for you. I hope this works. This is an actual call from my town. There was no way to remove the address of the call without sort of losing some of the important information, so please respect the confidentiality of the case. Also keep in mind that at the time of this call, there was a single dispatcher on duty. He was the only guy there. So you will hear about halfway or maybe a third of the way through the call, he's going to dispatch the units out, and then he'll come back to the caller. So when you hear him starting to talk to the units, that's what that is. So we'll see if this works. And Christian, just give me like a thumbs up or a thumb down if this is working, because I'm not sure if I'm going to hear it on my end.
Madison, I want to discuss the emergency.
Yes, 54 Edinburgh Lane, please. My husband just fell out of the car.
He fell out of the car with you.
Just a minute, what? Okay.
He can't breathe.
Okay. 54 Edinburgh Lane, please.
Okay, he fell out of the car. Is there anything else going on?
Yes, can't get enough air. His oxygen canister isn't working.
Okay, so we have breathing difficulty. How old is your husband?
78, no, 79. I know. Here? No.
What? Stand by for medical dispatch.
I don't know what to do.
54 Edinburgh Lane.
Okay, come in. They'll be here soon.
Ma'am, don't hang up. I got questions for you, okay?
Yeah. I don't know how to do it, honey.
Response 54 Edinburgh Lane. Ambulance in.
No.
Breathing difficulty.
Just a minute.
Oxygen.
They'll be here soon.
Properly.
He's on the floor now.
Endeavor and drive to the dead end. Time about 2015. Sorry, they've been dispatched.
I don't know how to do it, Mike. I don't know what to do. We don't know what to do.
Where is he? Outside or inside the garage?
Wait, just a minute. Wait, honey.
Is he conscious, ma'am?
No.
He's not awake right now? He can't respond?
No, he can't.
Is he breathing at all, or does he need the oxygen to breathe?
Yes, right now. Yes, you need it immediately. Can you get here immediately?
Oh, they're on the way. They're already en route.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
Oh, he has a stroke, yes. Oh my God.
So when you look at his chest, is it rising? Do you see him breathing?
He's lying on the floor. He's lying on the floor. We don't know how to do it. Okay.
Is he changing color, ma'am?
He's on the floor. I can't see.
If you touch his hand, is he clammy?
Yes. We're trying to get him to have oxygen. He has canister. I don't know what to do either, Michael.
Okay. Right now, you just need to wait. You need to stay calm and wait. If he loses consciousness, we can go from there. Does anyone there know CPR? If you need it?
No.
Okay. All right. If for some reason
If he loses consciousness.
If he loses consciousness, I can walk you through CPR, but we can't do anything until he loses consciousness. Okay? So just stay on the phone with me.
All right, let me flip back over to my view here. So let me just run through what happened real quick. I think just from listening to the call, you're probably getting a sense that the dispatcher did not do a spectacular job here. And I was asked by the dispatch supervisor in Madison to review this case. And let me just explain for you what happened real fast in the call here. So the caller, the woman, is the wife of the patient, and the guy in the background, Mike, is their son. And they had just driven home from somewhere with the patient, Dad, in the back seat of the car. They pulled in the garage, they opened the door of the car, and Dad fell out on the floor. Had expired some time ago in the back of the car, and nobody had noticed it until they opened the door and he fell out. This was an elderly patient with numerous medical problems. He was on home oxygen, as you can hear, and in fact, his oxygen canister had run out. And whether that contributed to his death or not, we're not quite sure. So to some kudos, some points for the dispatcher. The first thing the caller says is, my husband just fell out of the car. So this is sounding like it's going to be a trauma case, but it becomes apparent to the dispatcher relatively quickly that that's not where the money is. This is not a, he fell out of the car while we were driving down I-95 at 80 miles an hour. And very quickly comes to the realization that this is a respiratory call, and you can sort of hear him in his head switching the card set, and they were still using paper cards at the time of this call, not the computer system. You could hear him flipping over to card 6, which is the breathing problems call. You can hear Mike in the background talking about how he can't breathe, and the dispatcher did not hear that. And when I reviewed this case, when I played this call back with the dispatcher, when he heard Mike in the background say he can't breathe, he sat up and said, oh, I didn't hear that, I missed that. And he was focusing on what the caller was saying, trying to sort out the breathing issue from the trauma issue, and did not hear Mike say in the background that essentially this patient was not breathing at all, which would have taken this from card 6, breathing problems, over to card 9, which is the cardiac arrest, and would have led this in a completely different direction. As you guys all realized toward the end, he had a couple opportunities to kind of correct that error and never did. It was clear halfway along the line that the patient was not conscious, and yet at the very end he's saying if he loses consciousness, we can then talk about CPR. We've changed the wording now, and we don't ask about doing CPR, we tell how to do CPR. You would not have a dispatcher today saying, does anybody there know how to do CPR? It would be a directive. I'm going to tell you how to do CPR. And they'll often tell them to put their phone on speaker, put the phone down next to the patient. I'm going to tell you how to do CPR. And the assertiveness with which the dispatcher says that can sort of help motivate that along. We've also learned from recent research, largely out of Japan, and I'll talk to this a little bit later on, that doing chest compression only CPR with the dispatcher instructions is a much higher rate of compliance and success than if you're trying to get them to do 15-2 or 30-2 with the ventilations. So I went through this call on the card, and if you happen to have access to card 6, 2 of the things that he was asking the caller, is the patient changing color and is the patient clammy? Those are questions directly off of card 6, designed to help prioritize this call. In my mind, never should have gotten that far. I think it should have been a little bit obvious to the caller a little bit earlier on that this was essentially a cardiac arrest, at least a respiratory arrest, if not a cardiac arrest. But he did go through some of those questions. So again, I've got the hindsight. I've listened to this call probably 100 times because this is the call I use when each of my residents comes to me on their EMS rotation for a quick little talk about dispatch. So I've listened to the same call 100 times, and the dispatcher only got to go through this once. And when I went through the call with the dispatcher in question, he picked up a lot of things going on in the background that he just did not notice the first time through. He was so focused on what the caller was saying. And that's very common. You just sort of got to take that into consideration. So let's just move on, talk about what the quality management structure of your dispatch center is. And I will tell you that most of the dispatch centers in my area are not large enough to have these 3 layers. This is sort of designed for the larger center. So let's kind of put this in the context of Sydney, for example, where they're doing 1 million calls a year. So the quality improvement unit is the 2 staff members who spend all day listening to calls and scoring them. I can't think of a more boring job in EMS. Maybe there is one somewhere, but I don't want that job. They listen to all cardiac arrests. They listen to all pediatric calls. They get triaged to a fairly high level. And at least some percentage, I don't remember exactly what percentage, it's something like 2% of each call taker's calls over the space of a month. They review a minimum of 3% of the entire dispatch center's calls to try to make sure they're getting a representative mix. They then have an MDRC, Medical Dispatch Review Committee. We had our AMR MDRC meeting last, I guess it was Friday, right after I got back from NAEMSP. And I'm on that committee. And it's sort of the middle management. They'll talk about the data from the quality management folks and see, are there any problems we can identify, any particular cards that are giving us trouble that maybe we need to focus a CDE session on, something like that. And then at the top is the dispatch steering committee, which around here is usually a town structure. That's fairly high up. It's the chief administrative officer of the town. It's whoever the dispatch center director is. For those of you who came on the call a couple minutes early, Jim Augustine and John and I and a couple others were having sort of a sidebar conversation about who owns dispatch. Is it a police function, fire function? Very political. So that'll be who's got that dispatch steering committee role. And that's often where the medical director is. I tend to be a little bit more hands-on with our larger centers and sit on that middle layer there. And this is not, you have to be doing it this way. This is simply the recommendation from NAED, and there's numerous other ways to do this, but at least this provides some structure for how you're doing it. I want to turn my attention to research for the rest of this, the next maybe 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. There is not a ton of research out there, but it is definitely getting better. You're seeing more and more dispatch research coming out. And most papers fit into one of 4 types. And I'm just going to give you some examples of each of the types here. Here are some chief complaint studies where you're simply pulling one of the chief complaint protocols and deciding whether the card is doing what you want it to do. Something simple like, when I look at the abdominal pain card, am I correctly sorting the high and low acuities? The 4th one here for acute stroke is telephone triage correctly identifying patients with stroke. That study is being redone now because there's now a stroke scale in the dispatch system, kind of like the Cincinnati scale or the Los Angeles scale that our pre-hospital personnel are using. to try to help the dispatchers determine whether a patient is having a stroke or not. So there's a fair amount of research on that. Now you'll notice that Jeff Clausen's name is on a lot of these studies. He does a lot of research of his own system, and you may think, all right, that sounds kind of like a conflict of interest. I will give Jeff credit. He is not at all willing and not at all unwilling to say when he finds a problem. If he does a study and finds that one of his protocols is not doing what it's supposed to do, he'll publish his study and he'll work to improve that protocol. So, you know, you'll see his name out there on a lot of this research. I think that's probably okay. He does a very nice job with the research. Category number 2 is simply, is your system as a whole, not for a given protocol, but overall doing a good job of sorting your high and low acuity patients? So let's say you're in a system with limited ALS resources, and your folks in the field are telling you, geez, doc, we're sending ALS units to a lot of calls that turn out to be BLS, and then we're not available for the real ALS calls. We need the dispatch center to do a better job of discriminating the calls we need to go on from the ones we don't. There have been a number of studies of that. I will tell you that in general, EMD over triages, which I think is probably appropriate, just like our stroke scales over triage, like our trauma activation systems over triage. Most dispatch systems over triage a fair amount. And the question is that too much? Is it the right amount? Is it not enough? And you'll just sort of have to decide for yourself based on what your data look like. But there have been a number of studies looking at the ability of the systems to discriminate the high and low acuity patients, which is kind of a surrogate for ALS versus BLS responses. There's also been a handful of studies looking at the pre-arrival instructions and the dispatch life support instructions. Some of them are listed here. This is where we've come to the realization that chest compression only CPR is the way to go for dispatch instructed CPR. 2 good studies out of Japan, I should probably add them to this slide, one for adults and also one for kids. They actually found that changing to chest compression only CPR improved their survival rates for pediatric cardiac arrest, and that's really hard. That's kind of an impressive achievement. And then finally, some of the diagnostic tools. I mentioned the new stroke scale that we have here, some studies looking at how effective that is. We've also, if you look at the 3rd bullet point there, we've learned from data over the years that many of the cardiac arrest calls that are not dispatched as cardiac arrest, like the call we just listened to, are because there is some agonal breathing. So when the dispatcher asks the question, is the patient breathing? The caller hears some gasping or other agonal respirations and replies yes. So the question has been changed to, is the patient breathing normally? And there's some other questions in there if the dispatcher is in any doubt to try to sort out things like gasping. It would tell the dispatcher that it's agonal breathing. And as soon as the dispatcher realizes it's agonal breathing, the call is assumed to be a cardiac arrest and you go right to that set of instructions. So that's actually a big improvement that we've had with our dispatch systems over the last few years. If you want to do some research on your dispatch system, the structure and process pieces are fairly straightforward. You have the data, it's right there in your CAD. Depending on what CAD system you're using, whatever computer-aided dispatch software you're using, you should be able to get some general information to answer questions like how many calls fell into each of these determinant codes last year. We actually did that this morning at the meeting I was at. We're considering changing our responses on one of the Bravo calls, which are generally a hot response, dropping that back to a cold response. So we're going to have each dispatch center query their CAD and figure out how often this actually happens. If you want to look at Donna Badian's structure, process, outcomes paradigm for research, it's the outcome studies that are really hard. It's very hard to link anything that a dispatcher does to patient outcome, and that's because there's so many steps along the way. So this is where it's really difficult to get the data linkage. You need to somehow link your dispatch computer to your EMS records and then somehow link that to your hospital records. So even to ask a fairly simple question like, in your system, how many of the patients who were dispatched as a maximal response, we believe this patient is in cardiac arrest, how many of those patients actually got an ALS intervention in the field and how many survived? Just think about what a basic, straightforward question that is to ask, and yet how hard it is to answer. I'm not sure I'd be able to answer that in my system without doing a lot of manual paperwork because I don't have linkage of these data systems. Let me give you a quick example of a couple of studies that I've done here that actually changed my system a good deal. When I got here to New Haven in 1999, the New Haven Fire Department was sending a first responder engine company to every single EMS call, lights and siren, regardless of nature or severity. So literally, if you called 911 and said, I stubbed my toe, I need a ride to the ambulance, Engine 6 would show up at your door, lights and sirens, every single time. And I asked them, I said, why are you doing it this way? And they had 2 answers. They said, well, we're really worried about missing the real thing. Apparently there was a patient who was sitting on the New Haven Green, which unfortunately is where most of our homeless population lives, assumed to be intoxicated. The fire department did not go to that call. This was many years ago. The ambulance arrived and found the patient to be in cardiac arrest. And they said, we're never going to miss one of those calls again. We're going to go to everything. They also indicated that there is a public perception that the taxpayer dollars are paying for this service, and when they call 911, they expect the big white truck to show up. I put sick there because fire trucks aren't supposed to be white. We all know that. They're supposed to be red. That's okay. They're white in New Haven. I just have to live with that. And there really is a perception in the fire department as well as in the community that the taxpayers are paying for this service, and by golly, that fire truck better show up when I call 911, regardless of how minor the issue was. But the problem was, at the same time, AMR, the local commercial ambulance provider, was using the hot versus cold determinant as the protocol card would indicate. So you'd often have the circumstance of the fire truck showing up lights and sirens, and then 10 minutes later, the ambulance showing up no lights and sirens, which led to a lot of confusion and political stickiness. So the first thing that we did, we got this small grant from the National Academies that I mentioned at the top of this presentation, $3,500, to look at the Yale HMO. We have a very large physician-staffed HMO facility at Yale. It's not part of the hospital. It's a separate center, staffed by a physician 24 hours a day. And about 3 to 4 times a day, they call 911 to transfer a patient from their urgent care walk-in into the emergency department. Most of these are very unexciting calls, but the fire department was going to every single one of these calls. And then the facility actually started complaining to us and said, we don't need the firefighter EMTs in their turnout gear coming into the urgent care center where the physicians and nurses are already taking care of the patient. There's no real role for the EMTs there. So we convinced the fire department of this. They understood the wisdom of this. And we put a protocol in place that unless it is a confirmed cardiac or respiratory arrest, which is protocol 33D1, the fire department is not going to this center anymore. We're only sending AMR. And we did a very similar before-after study. 4 months before, 4 months after, we eliminated the month when the protocol was started because we knew there was going to be a lot of confusion. And we found pretty much what we expected. In the before phase, the fire department went to a lot of these calls, but rarely did anything. You'll see they hardly provided any care at all. And most of the care that they provided was simply doing the things that the urgent care folks hadn't done yet. Maybe the patient hadn't not yet given their aspirin for their chest pain. The fire department guy said, oh, I got some aspirin, I'll give them mine. We're not talking life-saving interventions here. In the after phase, they only went to this center 10 times, and it turns out 9 of those were protocol violations. There was only 1 actual cardiac arrest. And as you can see, they really didn't provide much care at all. And we reviewed all of the cases that were legitimate ALS calls, legitimate ALS level transfers, and determined that none of them would have benefited from having the first responders at the scene prior to the ambulance showing up. And the citation is there if anybody wants it. If you want to email me, I'll be happy to send it around to you. So the fire department then said, well, we've got a bunch of other medical facilities in the city that also have physician staffing or at least nursing staffing. Maybe we don't need to go to all the calls there. So we came up with a list of response determinants, the one shown in the second bullet point there, where we figured that maybe for some of these, particularly at night when there might be 1 RN covering an entire nursing home, we better send the fire department just in case. But we're not sending them to the Alpha Bravo and some of the Charlie calls. We implemented this. We did not do this as a research study because the city wanted to get this done right away. We didn't have time to put the study together. And then what happened is the fire union came to us and said, Doc, this is working really well at these nursing homes. Why aren't we doing it for the entire community? Why aren't we using the protocols the way the protocols are meant to be used? And we were able to convince the city to do it. The price we had to pay was we agreed to look at every single call that no longer got a first responder that used to get one and make sure we hadn't missed anything. So we essentially did exactly the same thing. We did a 4-month before-after trial. And we found that we decreased the calls that these first responders went to from 84% of all the calls in the city to 39%, so roughly half. The average engine company in the before phase was, even after we took out all those nursing home calls, et cetera, was still going to 5.5 calls, EMS calls per day. And we dropped that down to 3. And the bottom of the screen there, the last bullet point, those are the 4 categories where most of these calls fell: abdominal pain, assault, falls, and sick person. We're not talking assault like gunshot wound to the head. We're talking, hey, somebody just stole my wallet and hit me in the arm. Very low-level complaints, and those accounted for the vast majority of it. So then we had to look at all the cases that would have gotten a first responder to make sure we hadn't missed anything. This was the fun part. This was 1,816 calls during the 4 months after. I looked at every single one of them myself, and the 2 co-authors each looked at 250 to make sure I wasn't missing stuff. And we determined that out of those 1,816 calls, there were only 10 where having the fire department first responder there might have potentially made a difference. And you can see them shown there in the 6 sort of sub-bullets there. None of those patients got admitted to the hospital. They all did fine and got discharged from the ED. Even the opiate intoxication, you could think, okay, we need the first responder there to bag the patient. Of course, we have Narcan now. We didn't then. All those patients did fine. None of those patients got admitted. We found that in none of these circumstances where there was a protocol violation in that the first responders were not sent, didn't matter. So I was able to go back to the city and say, your dispatchers missed 0.55% of the cases, and there was no clinical problems with any of them. City was happy with that, left these protocols in place. So we're still doing kind of what we're supposed to be doing all along. So let me just wrap up here, and that'll leave a few question answer minutes if anybody wants to. Many of us think about medical oversight in the prospective, concurrent, retrospective mold. Let's take concurrent out. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in the dispatch center watching over these guys and listening to do some calls. I do that periodically. I visit some of the dispatch centers. When I'm giving somebody a tour, I'll certainly take them down there and show that to them, but I'm not doing real-time oversight. So I kind of divide our role here into prospective and retrospective. So prospective is simply protocol selection, review, and approval, doing what we did at this meeting this morning, updating the protocols, making sure everybody's okay with the transition from version 12.2 to version 13, et cetera. Checking that the response unit assignments are correct. One thing MPDS and the other programs do not do is tell you exactly what to send. It may tell you this is an ALS hot call, but it's up to you. For example, am I just going to send my ALS rescue, or am I also going to send a first responder? That's entirely a local decision. So what I'll do periodically on the 13th of February, I'm going out to the Woodbridge Police Department. They want to go through their codes and make sure that they don't need to update anything. They're sending the right units to the right types of calls, because that's all local decisions. Retrospective is simply all the quality management stuff that we've been talking about, participating in some sort of committee that's providing the review, doing the case review when they send a case to you to listen to and see whether you think they did a good job of it or not, making sure that there's good compliance. We don't always listen to the bad calls. I've had a number of really good calls sent to me, and usually what it is that the fire department is setting up some kind of award ceremony for the crews for, say, saving the baby from cardiac arrest or whatever. And often it was the dispatcher that really made the difference. We had a very similar case to that here in New Haven maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where the mother of the special child's need called 911 that the child had stopped breathing. And the dispatcher really saved the kid's life. The dispatcher settled mom down and talked mom through opening the kid's airway. And it didn't take much more than that to get the kid going. By the time the EMS arrived, the problem had pretty much been solved. And the dispatch center supervisor sent the call to me to listen to make sure that I agreed that, in fact, the dispatcher should be at this award ceremony, not just the crews that were on scene. So you got to think kind of of the positives as well as the negatives, though I'll tell you most of the case reviews I do are the problems. And then finally, the retrospective role in making sure that they're getting their dispatch education, providing one-on-one education if need be. So here's some take-home points for you. I think it's very important that we provide some role of physician oversight in dispatch, and many centers don't have this at all. And I think it's worth checking to see where you are to see what the role for the physician is. I think it's extremely helpful to take the course and have the card. And when I was visiting the center in Sydney, they had the exact same card that I did. All the dispatchers wanted to take out their card and show it to me and show me it was exactly the same card that I had. And with the exception of the allergies, bites, and stings card, which is really different in Australia with all the critters that they have, the cards are exactly the same. I could easily have picked up the phone and started processing calls in Sydney, no sweat. I could easily bring any of those dispatchers from Sydney to any of your dispatch centers and plop them down, and they'd have no trouble at all. It's exactly the same system. And I think having the knowledge of what you gain in the course, understanding exactly how the algorithms and the processes work is very helpful. So I strongly recommend that for the fellows. And then finally, the general caveat, we know a fair amount about dispatch, but I think there's even less research out there about EMD than there is about EMS in general. So I think continuing efforts are very helpful. When you're finished with this and you want to go sort of mop up your core content topic areas, I think it's worth reading Jeff's chapter. It's volume 2, chapter 10 of the current NAEMSP textbook. Jeff does a real nice job explaining the basics of medical dispatch. Some of the algorithms are reproduced in there, so you can kind of walk through them in a little bit more detail than I could do here. So I recommend reading that chapter. The next chapter, chapter 11, or maybe it's the one before, I don't remember. It's either 9 or 11, is the general EMS communications chapter. Probably read that at the same time. It talks a little bit more about the hardware issues that are involved in communications. It all kind of ties together. So I recommend reading the hardware communications chapter as well as Jeff's dispatch chapter in the textbook, and that'll kind of make sure you've got all the core content issues and the things that you might see sometime in perhaps September, October when the exam comes around. Okay. And I will stop there. We got about 6 or 7 minutes until the hour. I'm willing to stay on as long as people want to chat about this. And also, let me just give you my email address again, david.cohn@yale.edu. Couldn't be any easier if anyone wants to email me offline. If anybody wants me to send a copy of those research articles I was talking about or any of the other resources, I'm happy to do it. So, Christian, I'm going to turn it over to you if you want to moderate if there's any questions or discussion anybody wants to have.
Sure. Thank you, first of all. I want to take advantage. I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
One question, there's different types of companies that provide the cards, PowerPhone, APCO, the National Association. Why, is there a reason people choose different cards, cost, flexibility, or is it just preference for the,
Well, I will give you my opinion on this. And again, I have no interest in any of these. Cost is definitely a factor. In the APCO system, it's my understanding that if you are a member of APCO, if your dispatch center is a member of that organization, you get the dispatch package for free. It's part of the membership. MPDS is known to be more expensive than PowerPhone. And specifically in MPDS, let's say that you're at a dispatch center that does police and fire and EMS, and you want all of your dispatchers to be trained and certified in all 3 domains. That's 3 courses, 3 certifications, 3 sets of protocols. You get charged separately for each of those. It is my understanding that they're in the process of kind of fixing that and kind of merging them together. PowerPhone is kind of a one price for all deal. You can get all of your police, fire, EMS all as one package, and it's a little bit cheaper. Again, I'm hearing through the grapevine, and this is from the New Haven Fire Department, which currently uses PowerPhone and is looking to switch over to MPDS, but at the moment are having trouble convincing the bean counters of the wisdom of doing that. They are telling me that the national academies and MPDS are making it easier and a bit cheaper to do all 3. If you're simply doing the EMS, it's probably a wash. But if you're also doing fire and police, which I think most centers are, then price does become an issue. I will also tell you that part of my preference for MPDS is simply that I believe there's better research supporting MPDS than there is for the other systems. That's not to say, the folks at PowerPhone or APCO could start doing, a lot more research, or maybe we should be doing some comparative research. I've not seen any studies comparing any of the systems to each other. We just sort of pick a system and study it as an independent body, which is fine, and we have to do that. But maybe we need some studies comparing, and maybe that'll provide us a little bit more data on these various systems.
Next question, you answered part of this already. In terms of changing protocols, you obviously mentioned towards the end that you can change response configurations based on your needs and based on where they're going. You also mentioned a couple of times about changing the protocol or changing the card itself. It seemed that way, at least. Do you have the flexibility with MPDS to change those cards, to change how they ask questions?
No, you can't change the order of the questions, for example, but there are a handful of cards where the medical director there's actually a spot on the card for a medical director's signature. So one example, let me just find it so I don't make stuff up here. On Protocol 9, which is the cardiac arrest card, the medical director determines whether you're going to follow a chest compression only approach or a 600 initial compressions and then moving on to 2 breaths, 100 compression. There's a checkbox here. I'll try to hold it up to the screen here, right where my finger is, and the medical director has to indicate which approach the dispatch center is going to follow. Similarly, on the stroke card, how many hours from onset of symptoms are we going to dispatch this as an acute stroke at a high priority? So you then get to talk to your hospitals. Here in New Haven, it's 12 hours. We're doing clot retrieval and other neurovascular type things. So they would like the dispatchers to treat any stroke with 12-hour of onset as an acute stroke. And again, that's medical director input into the card. So I'm not changing the card, but I am changing some of the parameters and how certain things get handled. And there's probably 7 or 8 of those across the entire card set where the medical director, in discussion with the dispatch center, may alter things a little bit depending on how the local system is set up. So you're not actually changing the protocol, but you are changing some of the outcomes and outputs based on what your local system is. Okay.
So this is my last question. Obviously, you're hearing more and more about alternative resources that 911's referring people to, community paramedicine, psych resources. nurse answer line. So I assume that's going to be in the disposition part and the response configuration to get a certain card, certain answer. You don't send units, you send them to a different agency.
Right. So there's a category. So you've got your Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo in increasing order of severity, but there's also Omega. So here on the very bottom of the card is sort of a purplish Omega determinant, which means we're not sending anything. We're either telling the caller they don't need a response, or we're referring them to an alternative, like, you're going to go to an urgent care, or here's a phone number to call for a nurse advice line or something like that.
Okay.
In the MPDS system, your center cannot use those Omega determinants unless you've met some fairly rigorous quality measures, that they have confidence that your dispatchers are doing everything right. And then your dispatch center and your system have to decide, okay, what are these alternatives that we're going to offer, and under what circumstances are we going to offer them? I will tell you that in Sydney, which has a very sophisticated dispatch center, directly upstairs on the floor above the dispatch center is where there's a nurse-driven dispatch center for critical care transfer and their helicopter system. Some of those Omega calls, they actually turf upstairs where those same nurses essentially are providing a nurse advice line. Those nurses are part of the same dispatch center, and if they decide, this caller really does need a resource, they can turf the call right back downstairs and an ambulance is sent. And that happens about 30% of the time. A call that was originally triaged upstairs gets turfed back down. So you've got to have some mechanism in place that if this Omega is not working out and it turns out they really do need a response, you've got some way to provide that response. So at least in my area, we're not using the Omega determinants at all. We're sending something to every sort of call. It may simply be a BLS ambulance cold to check and see what the circumstance is. But I think as interest grows in community paramedicine options, if your community paramedic happens to be on duty and is out in the street in a vehicle, that's a great response to send. Send them cold, investigate the circumstances. They may be able to provide some level of resources that the traditional EMS crew can't. And that's kind of where we're going with that at the moment. I will tell you that other countries are way ahead of us on this.
Fair enough. I don't have any more questions. I don't know if anyone from the 26 folks left want to unmute themselves or raise their hands. I can see most of you. If not, I'll give you a few seconds. All right. I think we'll end it up. I want to thank David Cohn for presenting this. I'm personally I don't work with EMDs in my area. It's not something I'm familiar with, and this is very helpful to at least know if I ever do to start working with them, which is great. And I thank Dave for his time. We are going to take a little pause on EMS Medicine Live. I don't have any speakers coming up, and we're trying to get some volunteers in the coming months. If we get some, we'll let you all know, and we'll try to get back to a regular schedule. And that's it for now. Thank you again, Dave.
Thanks, Christian. Appreciate it.